1, 2, 3, 4.
Hello, you're listening to the Skylight Books podcast series. We are a general interest independent bookstore located in the Los Feliz neighborhood of Los Angeles, California. This year, because of the coronavirus pandemic, we've had to close our store and cancel in-person events. But Skylight is your neighborhood bookstore, and we are finding ways to create community even while we're far apart. In the coming weeks, we'll be putting out lots of new audio content to help you discover new books, connect with authors, and check in with your favorite booksellers. To learn more about how you can help keep Skylight alive, please visit our website at skylightbooks.com or check out our social media accounts on Twitter and Instagram. You can subscribe to the podcast on Podbean, iTunes, and Spotify. Thank you for listening and enjoy.
I'm so excited to be able to introduce our two guests tonight. The Unreality of Memory, which came out last week, August 11th, is a, quote, literary guide to life in the pre-apocalypse. These essays take the long view of centuries and the grand frame of global disaster and national collapse. They also take the short view of these months, weeks, days. They take up the magnifying glass and give us access to a kind of uncanny granularity. We're so lucky to have Elisa Gabbert with us tonight. She is the author of the poetry collections L'Heure Bleue, The Self, Unstable, and The French Exit. Her debut collection of essays, The Word Pretty, was published in 2018. The Self Unstable was chosen by The New Yorker as one of the best books of 2013. Gabbert's work has appeared in The New Yorker, Boston Review, the Paris Review Daily, Pacific Standard, Guernica, the All Electric Literature, the Harvard Review, and many other venues. She lives in Denver. And we're super excited to have here tonight in conversation with Elisa Brandon Taylor. It's also a great treat. Brandon Taylor is the author of the novel Real Life, which was a New York Times editor's choice. His work has appeared in Guernica, American Short Fiction, Gulf Coast, BuzzFeed Reader, O, the Oprah Magazine, Gay Mag, The New Yorker Online, the Literary Review, and elsewhere. He is the senior editor of Electric Literature's Recommended Reading and a staff writer at The Hub. He holds graduate degrees from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Iowa Writers Workshop, where he was an Iowa Arts Fellow. So let's have much warmth. I think there's already some pouring from the chat, just great gusts of it. So let's have a warm welcome for Elisa Gabbert. And how can I make myself disappear? Just like that. Okay. Thank you for your patience, y'all.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming. I've been really so excited for this conversation with Brandon. I'm so happy he's here. I see lots of people I know in the chat, and I'm so happy you all made it. It's been a wild week. I feel like I've been waiting for this book to come out forever. And now it's out, and it's quickly receding into the past. So I'm going to read just a short piece of an essay so then we can get to the Q&A. I'm going to read the opening section of this essay called The Great Mortality, which I feel like this is in a way too on the nose because it's about plagues and pandemics, and obviously you all know we're in one. It's a plague year. But this opening isn't really about, it's definitely not about this plague because I read it before this plague happened. And it's not, I hope it's not too relevant and too upsetting. Trigger warning, I guess. The Great Mortality. One day in April, I filled a glass with tap water from our kitchen sink and noticed that it tasted unusually good. A bit creamy somehow. A bit savory in the manner of club soda, which is superior to seltzer because of the sodium. It seemed especially thirst-quenching, yet so tasty I kept drinking more of it. A brewer I know told me Colorado water has more mineral content in the spring months due to mountain runoff, which might explain the change in flavor. I loved that idea, but the explanation didn't hold up. My husband, John, thought our water tasted the same as ever. More strikingly, every liquid I drank started to taste better to me. Wines tasted richer and more buttery. Cheap wines tasted like they'd been aged for years in oak. Bourbon tasted sweeter and creamier too, almost like coconut. Canned seltzer tasted especially great, like an indulgence instead of a substitute. This went on for weeks. The internet told me I might be pregnant or diabetic. I was quite sure neither was true. Instead, I grew increasingly suspicious that I might have a brain tumor. I mentioned the symptom to my brother in a text. I think I have brain cancer. My palate suddenly changed. He responded right away. I had that. It was a virus. Everything tasted weird and I couldn't handle spicy food at all. It lasted a few weeks. It didn't sound like what I had, but I was heartened nonetheless. But if it was a virus, why didn't anyone else have it? I mentioned it to everyone I saw, hoping for a sign of recognition. It's not unpleasant, I'd always say. Finally, about 3 weeks in, John and I were reading on the couch. He took a sip of water and literally smacked his lips. He said, that tastes delicious. Oh my God, I grabbed his arm. You have the virus. John's virus, if it was a virus, didn't last as long, or maybe he just wasn't as attuned to it as I was. In any case, it went away for both of us. Boxed wine tasted cheap again. Years ago, when I was in grad school, I saw the philosopher Daniel Dennett deliver a lecture about memes. Memes in the Richard Dawkins sense, a unit of cultural transmission. He talked about a kind of parasite. I'm going to be embarrassed if I mispronounce this, because Brandon would know. Dicrocilium dendriticum, or the lancet liver fluke, that infects ants. It makes them want to crawl to the tops of tall blades of grass. What does desire feel like to an ant? But that is not the end goal for the parasite. Those ants high up in the grass are more likely to be eaten by grazing cows, and that's what the parasite wants. This mechanism is called parasitic mind control. The fluke wants to be inside the cow. It thrives in the guts of the cow and then gets the reproductive benefit of being shit out into the pasture, where it can infect more ants. Both parasites and microparasites, viruses and bacteria, can hijack our minds. They make us act weird. Toxoplasma gondii, a parasite found in cat feces, makes mice less afraid of cats. This is an evolutionary strategy, making it easier for the parasite to get from the mouse to the cat. It can spread to people too, where it may increase risk-taking in general. One bizarre study found that people, presumably cat owners, with toxoplasmosis are more likely to major in business. An NBC News story suggested optimistically that the parasite may give people the courage they need to become entrepreneurs. If true, and I doubt it, that would be an extreme case of a microscopic parasite altering the course of your whole life. But ordinary viruses change our behavior too. A 2010 study found that people became more sociable in the 48 hours after they were exposed to the flu virus, the period when they are contagious but not symptomatic. The infected hosts, researchers noted, were significantly more likely to head out to bars and parties. Even symptoms we think of as purely physical reflexes can be construed as behavior changes. In Guns, Germs, and Steel, Jared Diamond notes that many of our symptoms of disease actually represent ways in which some damned clever microbe modifies our bodies and our behavior such that we become enlisted to spread microbes. The tuberculosis bacterium, for example, makes us want to cough, atomizing it into breathable air. According to the Mayo Clinic, this can happen when a tubercular patient coughs, speaks, sneezes, spits, laughs, or sings. This makes me wonder if consumption ever makes patients giggly or more likely to burst into song, despite the chest pain and malaise. One of the creepiest behavioral changes caused by a virus is hydrophobia, a symptom of classic encephalitic rabies, also known as furious rabies. It's not an exaggeration. People and animals infected with rabies become morbidly terrified of water. Or perhaps more accurately, there are two minds about water. They both want it and can't stand the thought or sight of it. It's the opposite of my virus then, which made beverages extra appealing. Here's how Bill Wasik and Monica Murphy describe it in their book Rabid, A Cultural History of the World's Most Diabolical Virus. Present the hydrophobic patient with a cup of water, and desperately though he wants to drink it, his entire body rebels against the consummation of this act. The outstretched arm jerks away just as he's about to bring the cup to the parched lips. Other times, the entire body convulses at the thought. Why does this happen? It's not so you'll die of thirst. The virus's goal is not to kill you, though it does do that. Once symptoms appear, close to 100% of rabies patients die. But to spread. The sole mission of a virus, according to Connie Goldsmith, author of Pandemic, How Climate, the Environment, and Superbugs Increase the Risk, is to get inside a cell and turn it into a factory to produce new viruses. Viruses, unlike bacteria and parasites, are not even alive, yet they too have desires. The rabies virus takes up in the animal's spit. According to an article in the Merck Manual of Diagnosis and Therapy, most people become restless, confused, and uncontrollably excited. Their behavior may be bizarre. They may hallucinate and have insomnia. Saliva production greatly increases. Spasms of the muscles in the throat and larynx occur because rabies affects the area in the brain that controls swallowing, speaking, and breathing. The spasms can be excruciatingly painful. A slight breeze or an attempt to drink water can trigger the spasms. Thus, people with rabies cannot drink. The spread of the virus to the salivary glands explains the telltale foaming at the mouth in rabid dogs, and the spread to the brain explains their rage, which drives them to attack and bite. This rabid madness and its transmission through biting gave birth to mythological monsters from zombies to werewolves and vampires. The association of vampires with bats stems from their acting as a reservoir host for rabies. Bats can carry the virus without dying from it. Rabies, like malaria, Zika, typhus, bubonic plague, and all flus, is a zoonosis, a disease that makes the leap from human to animal. From animal to human. That leap, the transmission, is called spillover. In his book Ebola, The Natural and Human History of a Deadly Virus, David Quammen describes zoonosis as a word of the future, destined for heavy use in the 21st century. Dangerous infectious diseases persist only when they have a reservoir host. We were able to eradicate smallpox, Quammen notes, because it's not a zoonosis. It only infects humans, and once we've cured them all, it has nowhere else to hide. The reservoir host for Ebola is still not known. It was initially spread to humans when hungry villagers in Africa ate infected apes. But apes are not an unharmed, oblivious reservoir. Where there are outbreaks of Ebola in humans, there are also dead gorillas. It seems likely that, as with the lyssaviruses that cause rabies, the host is some kind of bat. When Quammen went hunting for reservoirs in Bangladesh, the epidemiologist Jonathan Epstein told him, "Keep your mouth closed when you look up. You don't want an Ebola bat flying overhead to shit in your mouth." I always forget how much feces there is in this essay. During the 1950s and 60s, there was great optimism that the world would soon be rid of all deadly infectious disease. The United States spent huge sums of money on a campaign to eliminate malaria in the so-called Third World, an act of charity in a way, since malaria was not a threat in affluent countries. The plan not only failed, perhaps we gave up too soon, or perhaps it was an impossible task, but actually made the problem worse. The campaign reduced local immunity to malaria, while the virus evolved resistance to known treatments such as chloroquine. At the same time, heavy use of pesticides killed off many beneficial insects, while the mosquitoes became resistant to the chemicals. As Laurie Garrett puts it in The Coming Plague, Newly Emerging Diseases in a World Out of Balance, almost overnight, resistant mosquito populations appeared all over the world. Rachel Carson, the author of Silent Spring, said at the time, "The insect enemy has been made stronger by our efforts." After seeming to die down, cases of malaria resurged, now in a new iatrogenic form, created as a result of medical treatment. Malaria had become something strange and ill-defined. What is malaria? Kent Campbell, a doctor with the Centers for Disease Control, has asked. In many parts of Africa, it's endemic and omnipresent, but often asymptomatic. Previously, children with malaria either died or became largely immune. Now children might survive, but lapse into fatal anemia years later, requiring blood transfusions, not ideal when AIDS is epidemic too. Further complicating matters, when a child in Africa has a fever, it's standard procedure to give the child antimalarials. But just because a child has malarial parasites does not necessarily mean that any given fever is caused by malaria. In this way, it's like climate change. Every bad storm feels as though it must be related to global warming, but you can't say with complete certainty that any given storm is the direct result of climate change. And as Campbell says, we cannot continue to treat every fever as if it's malaria because the roster of drugs is getting shorter. Yet a malarial fever can lead to death, and malaria is still a top 10 cause of death in low-income countries. To answer his own question about the nature of malaria, Campbell eventually concluded that malaria is a disease that responds to anti-malarial drugs. He did not name a specific drug since the drugs have to change. It made me think of a conversation I had years ago with an ex-boyfriend, a physics major, who told me that temperature is not as simple a concept as it seems. It is not synonymous with heat or energy, he said. Temperature essentially is what thermometers measure. I never really understood this, but I think about it often. Or maybe I should say, what I think about is the elegant way the construction reduces what we understand. Okay, I'll stop there. Wait.
Amazing. It was great. Oh my God. Where to even begin? I mean, this is not the first question I wrote down, but since you did read from that essay, what I loved so much about it is that it kind of like surfaces this idea that you put forth in some of the earlier essays where you talk about that we used to have this idea that progress would usher us into like this utopic future where there was no more danger.
Yeah.
But that by creating all of these new things, we're actually also inventing the means of destruction. You know, so there's this great line, I forget who you quote when you say that like inventing the ship invented the shipwreck. And
Oliver really go.
Yes.
Proud of myself for remembering that.
You nailed it. And you know, sort of, you got to that passage, the part of the passage that you just read where you're talking about how, like, yes, anti-malarial drugs, but now there are all of these other complications that we didn't have before because now people are surviving, and now we're sort of not only shortening the roster of drugs to treat these awful sort of invisible microscopic catastrophes, but we're also inventing like new sort of lingering, like new ways of being on the edge of extinction, essentially.
Yeah.
And so I guess
Yeah.
like this isn't where I plan to start, but I'd love to begin our conversation on this this question of like, we used to think progress would save us, and now it's just new ways to die.
Right? Oh gosh. Yeah. I can't remember which essay it is, but there's an essay where I talk about like being very invested in this kind of techno-optimism that was very popular when I was in college, which is like around the turn of the century, let's say, the turn of the recent century. And there was a class, it was a computer science class, but it was more like kind of philosophy of computer science. And we read this Ray Kurzweil book that was all about like the singularity and how like, oh, we're so close, like any minute now, like technological progress is going to explode to the degree that it's just going to start solving all of our problems. Like we won't even have to do anything. It's so utopian, as you say. And, you know, and I really believed in that. I was like, seems convincing. I don't any longer believe in that. And I've actually come to think of the 20th century as kind of being like just almost this contained century of like such continuous progress that you can see why there was that illusion. And then I think it just kind of stopped. Like I sometimes I think it's kind of around 9/11 that seems too convenient. But sometimes I think like just like what great progress have we had besides like the iPhone in this century? You know, like a lot of the things that seem like progress are just sort of like slight improvements. Like, well, we found some new antibiotics because the old ones stopped working. But yeah, it just kind of feels a little bit like we're treading on quicksand a lot of the time, and that the solutions are just as likely to destroy us as the problems we're trying to solve. It was kind of late in my research process that I found this book called Normal Accidents by Charles Perrow. And his whole theory, it's very like famous in sort of engineering circles, because it's about how the fact that if you introduce a safety system into any system, basically you're going to increase the complexity of the system, and therefore it's going to be more likely to fail because it's more complex. And so that became like such a great metaphor for me for like what the whole book ended up being about, was just sort of like all of our solutions become problems.
Yeah, I mean, totally. I think there's a really great, not to be like a podcast white man about it, but there's a really great episode of 99% Invisible, I think, about that. The sort of introduction of safety also just like makes things work worse because of all the reasons that seem really obvious and self-evident when you're on the outside of such a system. I mean, you know, I also sort of wonder about the degradation and sort of this sort of cultural optimism around technology. I wonder if part of that is because like we've invented instruments that are now fine enough to deduce the ways that we're degrading. Like, and you know, like it feels like what the sort of major revelation of like the 21st century is like our ability to sort of like introspect and be like, yeah, we're not doing great. Like we you know, like for the first time in like, you know, human history, perhaps we have like these machines that are capable of storing like these huge tracts of history, and not just like one history or one version of a history, but we're collating, you know, all the we're able to collate all of these various like historical phenomenon and sort of really look at them and line them up and be like, oh, we're actually not killing it the way that we might have hoped.
Well, so I mean, no shade on podcasts. I was listening to a podcast today. Basically, every day when I go on a walk, I listen to a podcast. And it was the New York Times Book Review podcast, which I know you listen to too. But they were talking to somebody who wrote this book about hurricanes. And Pamela Paul asked him, like, well, you know, our technology, it must be really good now. Like, we can predict when hurricanes are going to happen. It's amazing. And he was like, well, sure, it's amazing, except that who cares if we can predict that it's coming if our emergency response completely sucks? And like all we do is just watch it come, and then we let it destroy cities, and people are just sort of like abandoned to their flooded homes.
Yeah, I mean, just great. Like, I mean, like the great, like we're so good at seeing and we just don't act, which feels like it sounds like one of the more like pessimistic Philip K. Dick stories. Except we live in it. But I guess to sort of back up a little bit to like the first question I had. So like in my thinking about this book, I needed to create like a false dichotomy to get my head around it. And so what I've done is I've sort of written questions that deal in like matter or like the subject material of the book, and questions that deal in the form and sort of the more technique-y things. Just know that I know that is like a false dichotomy, and like you can't divorce the two. But for my own like book Jeopardy brain,
I love that.
And so my first question is about this idea of the grammar of disaster and the grammar of catastrophe. So as I was reading the book, I kept writing in the margins, disaster is a retrospective object, because often when you were sort of recounting the disasters, it was like in the past tense and everything, you know, like comprehension was, you know, at work or whatever. And so, but then I had this realization that like, oh, perhaps disaster itself isn't retrospective. Perhaps what is causing this feeling of retrospection is the act of comprehension, and like the act of writing an essay. In some ways, like the act of writing seems like it can never be truly contemporary to the disaster it's trying to encompass. And I think about those really amazing and also cringy excerpts that you included from the New Yorker writers, like post 9/11, like they're sort of, and even like 2 days, maybe like not that long after 9/11, they were already sort of talking in this like nostalgic, like telescopic,
like aestheticizing it, right? In this weird way.
And so my question is, what do you make of like, one, do you think that an essay or like a piece of writing can ever be like truly contemporary to like the instant of a disaster? And two, if not, like what do you make of the tension between disaster and the form of like the written word, like trying to get the written word around the essay? And like how do you find that to be like a productive tension?
I mean, I will say like I just feel a lot of like discomfort and uncertainty with processing things that are happening right now. And that's why like I don't consider myself a journalist. I've tried to do sort of journalistic work where I can, but it's so not my strong suit. And like, I don't even like talking to people. I mean, I like talking to people. I like talking to you, but I don't like talking to like a source, because I don't have the training to like be objective, and I end up feeling like I'm manipulating them, or I'll feel guilty. Like I feel like, well, if I disagree with them, I'm going to feel bad about this. So like all of that I try to avoid, and I would much prefer to like process material from like books and newspapers from the time, or, scholarly medical journals even. I love stuff like that because it's so like artless. So I'm like, I can do all the artistic part. But yeah, so I prefer to kind of like, even though I was, writing this book post 2016, thinking about like the disasters that we're living through, I much prefer to go into the past and think about like, well, what can we learn from, the bubonic plague or the 1918 flu that might apply to a present or future pandemic, because like because of all the processing that has already been done, but I can also give myself as much time as I need to process it. So like, I think that's kind of what I do with the essay form, is like, I try to absorb a lot of information and then process it almost unconsciously, but I'll just kind of think about it for like weeks. And then like, finally I'll find, I'm starting to sort of write sentences in my head. And that's when I know I'm ready to write it. But I'll say that I'm like working on an essay for a really long time when I'm not actually like typing the draft, I'm just thinking about it and trying to figure out what I want to say. And like, it never starts with an argument. It's more just like, I want to think about this topic or this subject. And then if I end up making an argument, it just kind of comes out at the very end. So yeah, I think the reason that it feels timely to this moment is because like all disasters have so much overlap and so much similarity, and we make the same idiotic mistakes over and over and over again. So we can learn from the mistakes we made in the Challenger disaster, and that can help us get through today, probably more so than thinking about the mistakes that we're making right now.
Yeah, I mean, even in that really, I think, excellent first essay, it struck me that, there's that moment where you talk about how you were sort of just like moving through the routines of your life as like 9/11 was happening. And like your sort of recounting of your own self was like this very sort of stunted, affectless, I couldn't process it moment. And that was sort of laid side by side with like this really, I thought like really gorgeous, like processing of it. And you weren't just like processing the event, you were processing your inability to process the event. And it just like the way that those two things like rub against each other, the way that we in a moment when we experience or witness something horrible, like we just can't process it. And it's only in retrospect that we can see that we weren't processing it. But if you were to sort of be on the ground day one, like with this sort of pandemic, with the moment that's sort of encircling all of us, like I'm not like actively going through, like I'm not processing the, the COVID, but like when I'm like 2 years from now, if there is a 2 years from now, perhaps I might look back and be like, whoa, I was really not processing a lot of things, so there's something that's almost embedded in the grammar of the way that we talk about disasters and catastrophes that feels like not only, like you said, like not only like retrospective, but like aestheticized. Like we can't just talk about the past. We have to talk about what we mean when we talk about the sort of the what we talk about when we talk about disaster.
You made me think of your great essay that you wrote recently, kind of processing the beginning of the pandemic and all the anxiety and the panic, and how it I remember you said it just sort of came out in this big oh God, I have an idea for an essay. I'm still typing. It does it's almost like it happens all at once. That that understanding.
Yeah, it's not even like you started, like you said, it's not an argument. It's like a set of feelings that cohere around a vague idea of an idea. Like it's not even an idea. It's like an abstraction of an idea. Yes. My sort of follow-up question conjoined twin to this question has to do with visual media. And there's a way that in the way that an essay cannot be truly contemporary to the instant of the disaster, because it has to do all the sort of comprehension processing that we just talked about. But there's a way that like an image can be somehow, like an image kind of like captures and freezes everything. But in another way, like the image doesn't have the context that an essay can do. And so I was really interested in the way that you used image, both like, you know, some ekphrasis is happening on the page, I will say, but also like actual literal visual images embedded in the text.
Yeah.
And so I guess like, I'd love to hear what your thoughts about like that impulse to include pictures in the book and why, and what you think they're bringing in a way that, how do you think they sort of complicate and enrich the text?
Yeah. So, yeah, I want to be careful not to use like ableist language, but I do think like culturally, since most people are sighted, there is like a phenomenon where things that we can see, things that we can photograph and record and reproduce and put on the news, put on TV, make movies out of, you know, disaster movies based on real disasters. There's something about that process that kind of codifies memory and makes it feel like more real than real. I was doing a little kind of podcast conversation. We're such podcast people. I was recording a guest interview on a podcast yesterday with Adam Price on his podcast Fans Notes, and he was saying that he completely forgot about the Columbia disaster, like just completely forgot about it, or like he either merged it in his mind with the Challenger, or it was like too close to 9/11 and he just didn't have room in his mind for it. And it occurred to me like, oh, it's probably just because there were no visuals for it. Like it wasn't filmed. The Challenger explosion was filmed, and so like everybody even if you didn't see it at the time, you saw it at some point. But the Columbia disaster, it happened when they were coming back into the atmosphere, and that wasn't being filmed. And so there's no like popular visual that became associated with it. And so people just kind of forgot about it. So yeah, I thought about that a lot, just in the terms of like why is it that movies and TV and recordings make reality feel more real? I mean, I guess it's because we all have the same visual reference. And, you know, I think that could apply to things that aren't visual, like certain phrases that everybody knows, like, you know, everybody can say, oh yeah, Shakespeare, because we all know a few Shakespeare phrases. Like there's something about having that kind of shared memory that makes it feel like, well, that's a real thing. And yeah, I think the reason I wanted to include images in the book, besides just being like, you know, a dork who likes like Sebald and Ben Lerner, it's like, I want to do one of those books. They were sort of like images that I found really haunting, like almost to the point of like, yeah, almost to the point of like offensively haunting. You know what I mean? Like, like they're really intense, you know, like the woman with the scars on her back from the kimono.
And you kind of don't see them coming. Like you kind of like are flipping through the book, reading. And then you like stumble upon the picture of the man falling, who's jumped from, you know, the towers, or the picture of the sort of mushroom clouds. So you like the way that the images kind of like appear and haunt the text. They're these kind of like spectral projections. And I found that like really interesting. And this ties into another set of questions I have. So like there are all of these like moments in the essays where you unearth like really like unsavory aesthetic questions regarding like horrible moments in global history. And I'm thinking about the way you talk about the various aesthetic decisions that went into the recreation of the Titanic sinking. Like you're sort of careful, the way that you sort of carefully walk us through, like they made these choices. There are lights, there are no people. It sort of it sounds really, the way that you sort of carefully chronicle the aesthetic decisions of that Titanic recreation, you know, that thing that Oppenheimer had considered the visual impact of the bomb to be as important as like, you know, the power and the force of the bomb, as indeed it was like an extension of the bomb's power and force. And I guess like in a way the aesthetics, you know, the aesthetics are how a war or disaster find its voice. It's how its impact gets propagated through the culture. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about the aesthetics of catastrophe, and why we're made so uncomfortable thinking about how some disasters get better PR than others. Like you just said about the Challenger, the column, like some disasters get really great PR. Like for example, here in Iowa, an inland hurricane swept through the state, and like a quarter of the people didn't have power for 4 or more days, and like that's not on the news. So like, I'd love to
people
hear.
are just ignoring it. I mean, I guess because I'm a writer, I feel like I know a lot of people in Iowa, and I'm like, it seems like people are doing really badly. Like,
Yeah.
it seems like
I mean,
really
but it happens, it happens all the time in the sort of algorithmic hierarchies, and some disasters propagate and some disasters don't propagate. So I'd love to talk about like the aesthetics of catastrophe.
Yeah, I think so. Something that I was trying to do here, and who knows if I was successful or not, but like I wanted to put a microscope on that tendency and critique it while also not being self-righteous about it, because I totally do it too. Like I think everybody is guilty of it. So yeah, I think the reason I ended up putting the first essay first is because like that's where the obsession with disaster started. I saw this Titanic video and I was just like so creeped out. And I'd been like, I was watching it, like waiting for the moment when the ship breaks apart, which I can't even remember if I knew that happened until I saw like the James Cameron movie Titanic. But I was like, I'm just sticking around to see that part. And it was at like the very, very end of the video. And then I was just like, oh my gosh, this is so weird. This is fascinating. I want to learn more about Titanic. And I remember doing this before with 9/11, how you can really go into these like rabbit holes because they're fan sites. Like I swear that's the best term for them. It's like people are like, I'm a fan of 9/11. Like I have a website where I just, I document my obsession with this disaster. And there's diagrams and computer animation showing like how the beams melted and like exactly where the impact hit. And so, yeah, you can really get into it, and it ends up feeling like sort of like a video game of reality. So yeah, basically I wanted to kind of like dissect my own tendency to do that while also, I do want to be clear that I think it's bad. Like I think there are certain human tendencies that are like completely natural, almost like involuntary and uncontrollable, and yet like we should think about them and try to, I don't know, if not stop them, at least be aware of them and the kinds of things that they make us do. But yeah, one of the problems with this book is that like I don't have an answer. Like I don't have a solution to that. I don't really know how to fix it other than just kind of thinking about it and being aware of it and commenting on it.
Yeah, I mean, but to me, it was like, I mean, maybe it's because I'm chaotic, which I immediately was like, yes, Elisa, get them. Because it's true that, and you see it play out on social media all the time where like someone will post a video and they'll be like, oh my God, there was a horrible hurricane that happened. And then someone will be like, well, there was a hurricane in this part of the world too, and no one said anything. But there's the kind of like one-upsmanship. And my first impulse is to always be kind of like, why are we doing all this competition? But then I think, well, yes, because of like capitalism and empire, like you really do have to fight for eyeballs. And so then it's like this horrible idea of like disasters, catastrophes, famine, like they're fighting for eyeballs. And
it turns into like competitive empathy. It really does. And like, I mean, I think like on social media, people compete to be like the most offended, the most damaged. And, that thing where people will like share a video and say like, don't look away. I'm always kind of like, I don't know that I agree. I need to like watch a video versus like reading a description of what happened. If, like why do I need to actually feel the pain? I mean, maybe I do. Like I think it's arguable. It is arguable, but like I do think that gets into almost kind of like an aestheticization of pain. Like as though if you can't sleep that night or the video makes you cry, then like you're going to take some further action or be a better activist. And like for some people, I think that's true. I think for some people, like emotions radicalize you, but for others, it's kind of like, it's just throwing emotions at the problem and not offering any kind of solution.
Yeah, I mean, it really does feel like, and you know, this book helped me sort of get my own thinking around this like more solid and crystallized, but it really feels like we're subjecting the sort of vicissitudes of the global calamity to like the algorithmic sorting of the marketplace, and that feels like a really, really bad.
Yeah, it's so uncomfortable. It's so uncomfortable. And I mean, like, yeah, it is weird, and it often feels like random to me, like what ends up getting the kind of bulk of the attention. And there's sort of a whole section about that at the end of the book. Like how do these algorithms work? Like, why do we all decide like this is what we all need to pay attention to right now and not this other thing? And, you know, my hope is always just like, well, somebody's actually paying attention to it, even if it's not, even if it's not everybody on my feed.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know how those things work. It just seems to, it's one of those things like, you know, when you see just like one version of a tweet and it's like a joke you've heard 100 times, but for some reason that's the version that goes viral. Like it's totally random. I think sometimes the catastrophes that get attention, it feels like that. It's just some kind of random trip. Like, oh, you hit the viral jackpot.
Yeah, and it really does feel like because we're embedded in this sort of Abrahamic, like very Protestant context in America, that like we presume, like we put a lot of import into the happenstance virality. It's like, oh yes, you were anointed, you were chosen, you were plucked by the claw machine of fate up into notoriety.
Yes.
Yeah, like and
luck in the past feels like fate. It does.
Yeah. Totally. And it's all just like this retrospective construct. We're all just validating our own biases. Okay, I do want to get into my questions reform because I'm just like obsessed with this book. So like one of the things that I found really interesting about the book, there's that moment in the first essay where you talk about watching the Titanic video and you're like, there's like this really great line where you're like, it's really long. So I skipped around and looked at the parts that interested me. And that to me became that kind of like for me unlocked the structure of the book, because in a way, like you're kind of scrubbing around in these various ideas and finding the interesting or like the activated parts, and then you're bringing them into relation and you're thinking about them. And then when you get bored with it, you kind of like associate away from it to something else that's activated and interesting, that is in resonance with the thing. And so the whole book becomes this collage of like fragments you've clipped and put together and sort of assembled. And so I'd love to hear you talk about the form and like what you think this kind of collage structure or like the way that you collate things together. I'm just like fascinated by your mind essentially. So just like tell me how it works.
Well, yeah, I guess I just realized that it's actually very similar to the way I write poems now too. It wasn't always, but I mean, I like my writing to be like, you know, kind of short. I mean, I guess these aren't particularly short for essays, but the book is pretty short, and like really dense and like intense in that way. Like, like something that's just like, you know, like something that you eat that's almost too strong. Like I like every sentence to feel important, every paragraph to feel important. And, you know, that's of course, just like by my own standards, like feels that way to me. I don't know how other people read it, but so the way that I do that tends to be like only focusing on the things I find interesting and leaving as much out as possible. So yeah, I don't like to give a ton of context. Like I don't think that people need the full history of rabies to be interested in like why rabies makes you afraid to drink water. Like just that in and of itself is interesting, you know. It's kind of like when people, you know, on social media like share like one paragraph out of an essay and just in totally in isolation with no context, whatever, it can be really interesting. And so like I like paragraphs and sections. I tend to think in these larger pieces more than sentences, even more like I think of the paragraph as a form. And I really think through like sections almost as movements, like a movement in a piece of music. And I just like every part to be as interesting to myself as I can make it, essentially. And, you know, I'm kind of the same when I'm writing poems. I'm very slow with poems. You know, it's a lot fewer words than an essay, and it's usually on one page. But like, I want like every line to be good.
Yeah.
And sometimes if I like try to sit down and make myself write a poem, I'm like, I don't have 20 good lines in me today. I don't. I have 2. So I'm going to write those, and like I'll have to come back to this when I have another interesting thought. And it like takes time, like processing time and lived experience to like come up with interesting thoughts. And so there's a collector's mindset there. I remember reading something very similar, and I was reading this Selected Rilke recently, and you know, he wrote a novel. Do you know about this?
No.
I don't even know how to pronounce it. It's like the Notebooks of Malt. Somebody will have to tell me someday. I don't know how it's pronounced. It's this made up name, but it's like fake notebooks. And so it feels, you know, really kind of auto-fiction-y. But there's this part where he talks about like, oh, you have to savor like every memory and collect them over the course of your whole life, like the breeze coming through the window and that one beautiful flower. And then like one day, decades from now, you'll write a great poem out of it. And that sounds super corny, but like it's really good because it's Rilke. But that's kind of how I feel like when I go on a walk or when I'm reading books. I'm always taking notes or just kind of like thinking my thoughts and waiting for something good to come along. And then I sort of tend to collect it in a document or a notebook of some type. And then when I start to see like a pattern and a relationship among enough of those thoughts and ideas, or I find like, oh, I'm actually nursing an obsession. I just didn't realize it. All these things are sort of related. That's when I'll decide, okay, I want to write an essay about this, or I want to turn this into a poem. It kind of depends what the relationship looks like. But yeah, it's very like, it's like curating my own mind.
Oh my gosh. Oh, so many follow-up questions. But I want to leave time for like a Q&A. So like, I'll make this my last question. So on the matter,
so fast.
I know. So on the matter of internet rabbit holes, you talked a little bit about how it's possible to sort of end up down these tubes, and like the essays do kind of brim with a kind of feral curiosity and just like a sort of like endless hunger for more facts and like the message board for people who fear large objects, like. You know, you end up in some really incredibly interesting places. So like, that's a question I have. And I want to sort of do a mashup when I combine it with this other question I have, which is that these essays weren't written at the same time, but they do seem to iterate over a set of images or a set of ideas. And so I wonder about, because you do have this tendency to sort of like ping from one obsession or one rabbit hole to another. And you've mentioned your sort of collector's mindset. Like when you're putting together a collection like this, are those kind of large morphological touchstones visible to you? And do you curate the collection toward that? Or is that something that just like emerges when you feel like you've hit a critical mass of material that seems to talk to each other? Like, so like, did these resonances come in your revision process, or were they already the kind of landmarks by which you shaped the book?
Yeah. So it's hard to say now because
right.
it all gets confused, but I think both. I think it comes in from both directions. So I did write a book proposal for this book. So I had to kind of think through a structure before I'd completed writing it. I think I'd written maybe 5 of the essays. And then I kind of tried to build a book around that. And the finished book ended up being pretty different. Like that was 2 sections, and I ended up doing 3 sections and left some stuff out and added some new stuff in, combined a couple of essays into one, stuff like that. So I had some sense, like I knew that there would be a little bit of overlap between some essays. That just tends to be how my mind works. Like I just used the same metaphor yesterday, but it's like a Venn diagram, but like a chain where there's always just like a sliver of overlap. And that helps me organize the book a lot.
I love that. Like,
here's something that I touched on in the last essay. Now let's expand on it in this one. And then that's how the next one is connected. So yeah. And then, but also when I'm working, like those same obsessions just keep they just kept coming back to me. That's just, if like there's a line that resonates to me, like there were parts of that Alexievich book, Chernobyl Prayer, Voices from Chernobyl. I know the translation is different. I had like a UK version. Chernobyl Prayer is what my version was called. But there were certain quotes in there that were just like so apt to me when thinking through like, how do people process disaster? How quickly do things start to feel normal? You know, people like can get used to anything, no matter how insane it is, that I kept thinking of it. And I think that I ended up feeling like, okay, I referenced that one Chernobyl thing like too many times now. Like, I think my editor was also like, is this on purpose? And I was like, yes, but you're right, it's bad. So like I had to kind of dial it back a little bit in my final edits. But some of it is just that like, I'm like, I love this quote and like, it feels relevant to everything I think about all the time. So that kind of creates that overlap. But yeah, there were some kind of like echoes, I guess you could say, that I sort of intentionally set up because I knew that I wanted to do an essay about pandemics and plagues. And then I was like, well, wouldn't it be cool if I also wrote an essay about like mass hysteria? Because that's like, you know, the plague of the mind. And, you know, there's this kind of balance between the first section, which is all very exterior, kind of macro disasters. And then the second section is more kind of like what's wrong with us and our minds and the way we think about these things and the way we cause them, the way we remember them and misremember them. So that was like a very intentional parallel. But yeah, I think some of it is just sort of accidental because your brain does so much of the work when you're not even paying attention.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like you spend the first section of the book talking in so many brilliant ways about like the fungibility of like cultural memory in a way that like I sort of knew, but I often think of like cultural memory as being this sort of like long-term cache of images or whatever, and it changes, but it doesn't really change until we have like something really catastrophic happen. But I always consider like personal history and personal memory to be like much more fallible and fungible. But the way that you sort of talk about the way that our cultural memory is also a constructed object that is subject to the mores and weirdnesses of like the cultures that give rise to, I'm like, oh, right. It's all made up. Like none of that is. It's almost worse
because it's like if we all have the mistakes in our own memory, and then cultural memory is just compounding all of those mistakes.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's like the RNA polymerase did not have its proofreading function intact. But I mean, it's just like, but the way that you sort of juxtapose those two, the sort of unreality of both of those kinds of memory. I mean, it's just like really masterfully done. Essentially, I'm just like a really big fan.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Brandon.
Oh, please stop. You're a genius. I guess we should get to these questions.
This has been so great, y'all. And maybe we can all go to the sort of like cosmic bar after this.
Yes, please.
There's some really good questions, and folks should feel free to keep chiming in the Ask a Question tab. I know there's been some stuff that is like almost question adjacent in the chat. I kind of want to start with this one from Sarita, which says, she says, with regard to this idea of whether or not disaster is contemporary, since we've been living in an ongoing disaster for nearly half a year, is this a new kind of disaster? Well, not new, Journal of the Plague Year comes to mind, but it feels like and I think others, she says, but I don't want to speak for others, I'm trying to contextualize from within the moment. So I guess like it's about a question about what is the idea of the contemporary and duration.
Yeah. You know, I do think it feels new to us because of this idea of kind of American exceptionalism and American progress and power. I think that, you know, so many people I know, I've just believed for so long, like stuff like that doesn't happen here. And even when like you could see it coming, like every step of the way, like there's still something in your mind that's like, but surely something will happen to stop this before it gets really bad. Like, and there's these kind of like savior fantasies, you know, like I still indulge in them. I'm like, surely somebody will save the post office. Surely. So, I mean, for years I thought like, surely somebody will stop Trump. He'll do something like bad enough that like, they'll have to step in and be like, okay, this has gone too far. but now like it's 2020 and it's been horrible, and like nobody has saved us. Nobody saved us. So yeah, there's just I think a lot of us, I mean, who grew up in America, at least, like just grew up with that idea of like, oh, everything's going to be safe here. There's never going to be like a war here. If you came here from another country, you might not have had that at all, and you probably could see this coming a mile away. And but so that to me is the new part, that kind of feeling like it's not that it's new in history, but it's new in my lifetime. And yeah, I don't know how to deal with any of this stuff. Like I'm no better at it than any of you. Yeah, I don't know if that's a good answer.
Yeah, I mean, just to chime in a little bit, I mean, I think that part of this idea of like the disaster being constructed in retrospect, like I do think like, yes, like people are writing about it now as like a world historical, like an event of world historical proportions. But there was a way in which like, I don't know if y'all remember, but like, those early pandemic essays were instantly irritating to everyone who read them, because it felt like someone was like trying to stand outside of the moment and deliver the dimension that would like lift this up into like world historical proportions. And it's like, you can't write the history books yet. Like all you can do is journal. Like that's not the same.
Yeah.
And so I do think that part of what irritated me about a lot of the early pandemic writing was like those essays were so, it's like, who are you to try to stand outside of history and tell us what this means?
Yeah, they all had the same tone. Like, and like I wrote some of that stuff, and like I used the same tone too, and I would read them and I would think this is good, but they all sound exactly the same. It was all this kind of like sort of like dry wonder.
Yeah, no, totally. It was like poet voice, but in essay form. Like it was just like, wow, the cosmos, y'all. And it's like, yes, it's been up there the whole time.
Yeah.
But that's what I meant by sort of like, you can't deliver the sort of world historical dimension to a catastrophe when it's happening, because the history hasn't happened yet.
Right. I think also everyone is just so braced all the time for climate change stuff, especially like, there's just been so much like existential anxiety about that in the past, I feel like, especially 5 to 10 years. And when this like whole other, I mean, it's related, but still like a whole other disaster just kind of came seemingly out of nowhere for a lot of people. And it's just like, whoa, that's not even what I was bracing for. Like that, oh my God. Like, like we barely even talked about climate change this year, I feel like.
Well, I mean, between, the pandemic and the murder wasps and the white elk coming out of the woods and the dead moose with like smallpox and then the anthrax and the ice, like it's like every time you turn on the news, 2020 is like, it's got another one for us.
Extremely overwhelming.
Yeah. But that was a great question.
Yeah, there are a lot of good questions in here. I want to turn, there's some ones that I'm saving for the end that you can vote up questions. So if you want to have a say, feel free to vote up. And some of them I'm saving for the last question. But here's a question from Colin, who wants to know, what do you make, and I just think this feels like it flows out of what you're just saying about climate change and the sort of like current phase of disaster we're in. What do you make of the recent turn towards cozy, quote unquote, disasters in art? Like melancholy is focused on the isolated main character. It comes at night's rural setting. Do you think it has to do with a desire to not exploit disaster imagery, or does this show an overwhelming fear of it on the part of the artist?
Oh, wow. I don't know too much about this, but I instantly want to like Google this, like right after this event. Cozy? Ooh. I mean, I will say, I feel like there were points earlier on in the pandemic, and I think when we were kind of on true lockdown, when I felt like everybody in the country was really on the same page, where there was this kind of feeling of like cozy solidarity. And like in Denver, it snows a lot in the spring. So even when there's warm days, then there will be like a snowstorm and it'll get down to like 30 degrees in, April or even early May sometimes. And like during those times, I was like, oh, this is kind of nice because if I have to be stuck inside, like at least it's cozy in here and I can just read my novel and like try not to think too much about global meltdown. And then like, I mean, the good thing about it getting warmer and things like opening up a little bit is like I started to like see some friends, and that's good for the psyche, and go on walks more and stuff like that. But I did kind of miss that like coziness where, I mean, I think that's just regression probably. I don't know if when you were a kid you ever fantasized about like living in like a really small house, but I did. Like I wanted like a tiny round house with like a fireplace and like a chair and like a fridge, like all in reach. And I liked really small. I mean, I think kids in general like really small spaces, but like I had an armchair in my room, and instead of sitting in the chair to read, I would go behind it because it was like in a corner, and the back sloped, so it was like a little kind of tent space back there. Yeah, like a little kind of conical little hut back there I would sit back there to read, and I was just, like rereading the same books that I loved probably for the 20th time. So I do think, that like when I hear cozy, I think of that, like that safe, like go back to the womb, protect me thing. Like I'm not out in the open where the asteroid's gonna hit me. Yeah. But like I said, I want to immediately look this up because I don't really know a lot about this.
Yeah, I mean, same. I used to fantasize about living in a cottage. I grew up on a farm, and so I was never far from cottage in reality, in retrospect. I mean, I do think that there is this kind of like cozy / cottage core creep in all genres of art somehow.
Right.
And
cozy mysteries I know about.
Yes.
Like the British cozy murders or whatever.
I mean, there is something really unsettling about the sort of proximity between like cozy comforts and calamities. But I do think that there is something, I don't know if it was like is a fear of like facing the full horrific brunt of like disasters. But I do think that there is something to that idea of like making it palatable to mass audiences for mass media. So you're going to put Emily Blunt in like a really large cowl neck cardigan while she hides in the woods from the aliens that are coming to eat her and her family, right? Like everyone's always dressed kind of like shabby chic in these kinds of, especially in like Melancholia, which is all about the aesthetics. It's not even about the disaster. Like the disaster is subordinate to like the aesthetic experience of beauty and such things. Yeah, I don't know. Those are my thoughts about cozy. Who doesn't want a cardigan and a cottage?
I love that. So I think that these are like a good two questions to end on. One looking forward and one looking back. Speaking about what you were saying, Brendan, about constructing disaster in retrospect or standing outside of history, not to imply that there's a disaster issue here. Adelina wants to know, Monica wants to know, the question I want to ask is Marilyn's question. How would you qualify the continuum, Elisa, or the common ground of all your books?
Sorry, I blinked out for a second.
The continuum of all my books?
Yeah, like what do they have in common, looking back?
Yeah. I think I have, certain obsessions that are absolutely present in all of them. Memory is a good, but even more just like the sort of construction of the self, like which tends to be based in memory, of course, because like what else do we have besides memory? Like even the present is just swiftly becoming memory. So yeah, all of my poetry is very like obsessively about that. Let me just two things. My favorite things in the world are like language and thinking. So I like thinking. I like thinking about thinking. I like thinking about language. I like writing about thinking. I like writing about language because writing is like thinking through language with language. Those are my absolute favorite things. And so like all my writing is just kind of an excuse to do that. So when I write criticism, I'm like thinking through the best way to express in language my thoughts about a book, which of course is language that represents somebody else's thinking. And I guess you could say that everything is this, but it's like to the degree that like, if I'm going to play a game, like I want to play Scrabble or do a crossword, like I'm not interested in puzzles, even remotely. They're not verbal enough. too visual. I don't really like Instagram because it's so visual. I prefer Twitter because it's verbal. So like, I think you'll find that kind of obsession with language and thinking in all my books, 100%.
Yeah, I agree with that. Totally.
Well said. All right, last question. And this I'll turn to you both. Adelina wants to know, have you developed any new obsessions since publishing this book? So this is maybe more...
Are we not answering another?
Oh.
What are we doing?
Am I here? Did I mute myself? Am I here?
I can hear you. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Am I supposed to answer that question?
No. I think that's all. I'm just last one. I'm going to turn to both of you.
But I certainly can answer it. I mean, I don't know. The continuum of my books is just like gays being sad in the Midwest so far.
I think we have to make a bookstore section.
That's the sum of it. Grad school is a miserable experience. Don't ever do it. Parts 1 and 2. Yeah.
I do have a new obsession since this book. Well, not since this came out, because it came out last week, but since like I've stopped working on it because it was definitely 100% done in April, and it's been the pandemic obviously the whole time. I've become really obsessed with reading writers on like despair and depression. Earlier this year I read Yi Yang Yi's book, Dear Friend from My Life, I Write to You in My Life. Have you read that, Brandon? It's so good.
I have. She's a genius.
So good. And so she wrote it when she was going through a period of like very just suicidal depression. And it's really all about kind of the books, especially that she turns to in times of despair, and like her favorite books to reread, and reading especially writers' letters and journals, and that kind of personal connection she feels to that material. And I love that. And I spent a lot of this summer reading this gigantic biography of Sylvia Plath that I just wrote about. And obviously, Sylvia Plath struggled with depression her whole life.
Yeah.
So I feel like that's something I want to write about at some point. I don't know, because I like probably a lot of you have been feeling despair for much of this year. And so, like using writing and books as a way to kind of get me through despair, like, just kind of telling myself, as long as I have books, like, it's still worth being alive.
That's such a beautiful thought. That's so beautiful. I cannot wait to read that. Drop the link when it's ready. Elisa on sad things.
Oh, I will.
I feel like this was your book on dread and the mortal condition, and now you're going to do sadness and the mortal condition.
Yes, I have to. It's the natural progression, absolutely.
I mean, Cameron has thoughts about that, I'm sure.
Something to look forward to. Any obsessions from you, Brandon, before we close? Recent obsession?
I don't know what happened.
Oh no, I think we're having
Agnes coming back.
I think you can hear me. I think we're having some technical issues. Can you hear me, Elisa?
Yes. The question, Brandon, was, do you have any new obsessions?
See, this explains it. I blinked out before and I missed this part. New obsessions, yes. I'm currently obsessed with Patagonia, the outwear band, like the outerwear sports brand that's all about sustainability. And I keep watching their videos on how their clothes are made, which to me means that I'm going to be writing a story about the people who make the Patagonia things, or people who wear Patagonia. That's normally how I know I'm on the edge of like a new project, is like when I start watching like one kind of thing on YouTube exclusively, and it's been Patagonia and like Dior. Like those are like the two things fighting it out in my obsessive mind right now. So you'll know when I like show up and I'll be like, Elisa, I've written 5 news stories about Dior and Patagonia
story.
about Patagonia and farmers and fly fishermen.
Absolutely look forward to that.
I'm in a real outerwear kind of mood in my YouTube watching.
This has been so good. I'm coming back on video so I can say goodnight, y'all, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Everyone loves you, Elisa.
Joined us. Everyone loves you, Elisa. Everyone loves you, Brandon.
You're a genius, and we love you so much. Everyone should buy Elisa's brilliant new book. You can click the link
Skylight
down below.
wherever we see it. Yeah.
Wherever the button is, you should buy it. It's amazing. It fixed my brain. It just, oh, I have thoughts all the time now, and that wasn't how it felt before.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Elisa, for fixing me.
Thank you. Thank you for reading the book and talking to me about it. That was so wonderful.
Oh
And
my
thank you so
gosh.
much for listening.
Of course.
Thank you
And
so
thank
much
you,
for being
Agnes,
here.
who crushed it.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you to Skylight.
Thank you all for being here. Good night. Good night. Be well.
Okay. Good night, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Skylight Books podcast series. Please don't forget to visit our website at skylightbooks.com and make sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast for more author talks and bookseller conversations. You can find us on Podbean, iTunes, and Spotify. Stay safe and healthy, and we hope to see you back in our store soon.